The original Driver left me in admiration. I loved being able to go anywhere I wanted, cause as much mayhem as I could, evade the cops for the longest time, and smash up other cars as I did it, within the confines of the car at least. While I held it in such high regard, and to this day I still do, there was this empty void I always wanted that I didn't think I would have ever gotten. It's something that I was already used to at this stage in another game series, Grand Theft Auto. And that was the ability to get out of my car, fire weapons and steal other cars, do everything that GTA did, but in a 3D environment. That was my dream game at the time. Well, cue the year 2000, where my cousin arrived at my house with a handful of copied games. Yeah, I know, I was terrible back then. And there were at least 3 games I can fully recall. They were Thrill Kill, which is a 4-player fighting game that was never actually released due to its shameless violence and mature themes. WWF SmackDown 2, and Driver 2. At this point, I never even knew Driver 2 existed. I was shocked that they made a sequel, so I was absolutely excited to try it out. The first thing I did when I booted up the game was dive into the Take a Ride mode and start driving. After a few minutes, my cousin told me, "Did you know that you can steal cars in this game?" I said, "What?" I didn't believe him. He assured me he wasn't lying. I didn't know how to do it. I still didn't believe him. He said, "Press up and triangle." And I did. I thought, oh my god, I'm out of the car. And I'll get more into that in just a moment. In the meantime, welcome to GB Gaming. I'm Gamerbhoy and this is GB Reviews, and today I'm taking a look at Driver 2 on the original PlayStation. Driver 2 was released in the year 2000, and in the United States it was known as Driver 2 The Wheelman is Back, while in Europe it was called Driver 2 Back on the Streets. It would also make its way over to the Game Boy Advance 2 years later. Developed once again by British developer Reflections Interactive, Driver 2 serves as a sequel to the original game. It was set to broaden on what the original Driver did, and not only allow us to drive a car in a free roaming environment, but it offered the ability for the player to get out of the car and roam around on foot. Therefore, you could find and effectively steal other cars. Furthermore, this would allow you to play the Take a Ride mode pretty much indefinitely. Whenever you wrecked a car in Driver, that was it, game over, try again. But in Driver 2, if you wreck a car, you can get out and take another, and essentially reset the damage meter to 0. This was also handy for evading cops, in that you could lose the cops that are in pursuit, get out, and then your felony meter would also reset to 0. So in essence, the only way to get a game over screen of any kind in Take a Ride mode is to get busted. You could also unlock more vehicles by finding them in secret locations throughout the environment. This was also the first game in the series where you could actually select from a list of cars to begin with, instead of being assigned a car like in the original game. And it goes beyond that. you could not only pick a car, but you could also drive vans, buses, trucks, fire engines, limos, and many, many more. The driving minigames from the original game also make their return, and all the expected game modes are there, such as survival, checkpoint and pursuit. There is also the inclusion of a 2-player split screen mode, which allows 2 people to play a series of various modes in a minuscule version of the city they choose. You can play capture the flag, checkpoint and cops and robbers, as well as a smaller version of the take a ride free roaming mode. And speaking of cities, Driver 2 is once again set in 4 different locations. This time you are not confined to 4 American cities, and instead the game takes place across America, Cuba and Brazil. Chicago, Havana, Las Vegas and Rio de Janeiro to be precise. Now that we have all of the smaller game modes out of the way, let's get into the meat of Driver 2, which is once again the undercover mode.
You'll wish you never met me.
Maybe he don't even exist.
Vasquez. All guesses play even. Well, Lenny's gonna show next.
If Kane gets to him, Pink Lenny's gonna show up in pieces. All over Illinois.
So what is it Lenny knows?
The story follows Tanner and his partner Jones in their pursuit for a man who is named Pink Lenny, who originally works for someone called Solomon Kane, before eventually going on to work for a man simply named Vasquez, a gangster from Brazil. Interestingly enough, the developers were very clever on concealing this character's face to maintain his mystique, even to the point of making him the only character in the game's manual that is silhouetted out.
Vasquez will come back for you.
One recurring character who would become a mainstay in the Tanner saga from this point onwards is Charles Jericho, who I thought was an absolute badass. I mean, look at him! He walks around in a long leather coat with 2 sawn-off shotguns in his hand, and he doesn't give a flying fuck about anyone. He is just awesome. I absolutely love this guy. It also becomes pretty apparent that Driver 2 really does improve on the cutscene presentation when compared to the last game. I remember laughing at the way the characters were animated in the original Driver and the way they moved around.
You don't get it, do you?
Lay a little more of that green stuff on me, man, and I will sing you any song that you like.
But here in Driver 2, they look much more refined. And for the time, it was pretty realistic. In fact, it goes beyond that. Once you come back to the game and reload your story progress, you are given a quick recap of the events that took place leading up to the point that you're at, showing all the main segments of cutscenes that were played before, effectively giving it a very TV drama feel to it, and I thought it was absolutely amazing.
You know what these marks mean, Jones, do you?
Then he let it slip. A Brazilian's making a drop tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Kane knows. He knows.
He sold us premium bull.
I had never seen anything like that in a game prior to this. The mission variety is just as it was in the original game, and despite being able to get out of the car and steal other cars, the game's focus is still very much the driving aspect. As it was in Driver 1, you will play the undercover mode in each of the aforementioned 4 locations, unlocking the final 2 once you reach them during the story. And each of these cities are absolutely huge compared to what they were before. Another small improvement that seems negligible nowadays, but was a big deal to me at the time, was the inclusion of curved roads. I don't even know why I love this aspect. I just did, because games like the original Driver, Die Hard with a Vengeance, and Grand Theft Auto, all the roads were all grid based, and driving through them felt a bit samey. There wasn't enough variety in the layout. Like I said, it's completely negligible, but I really liked its inclusion. The soundtrack of Driver 2 is a little bit more varied this time around.
I'm gonna pop your neck with my hands.
Of course there is unique background music set to each city, but this time they are all very much themed around the particular locations that you're in. For example, for Chicago, the music you will hear is a typical indie rock number. For Havana, the background music is reminiscent to that of son cubano music, I think I'm saying that right, which is traditionally Cuban in origin. For Las Vegas, the music has a Western American influence. And Rio de Janeiro has a very samba-esque soundtrack to it. And while I found it to be a nice touch to include themed music based on where you are, nothing will top the 70s style of rock inspired music from the original Driver. You cannot top any of that. There are also a handful of licensed music in Driver 2 as well, such as tracks from the likes of Etta James and Hound Dog Taylor. Fun fact, there is also a mission pretty early in the game where you can hear what I believe is the very same guitar riff from Tekken 3's Paul Phoenix stage. Just listen to this. No joke, it's the same fucking song. Nice touch, Reflections, nice touch. I'm going to briefly touch up on the Game Boy Advance version, as I believe it cannot be ignored how impressive it was to get this game running on that system. Aside from the obvious graphical downgrade, other differences include the omission of Las Vegas and Havana, with Chicago and Rio being the only two cities you play in. The in-game cutscenes were replaced with still images and text, with a few sound effects thrown in. And other omissions include roadblocks during police chases and licensed music, which was replaced by a generic score. I cannot say too much about Driver 2 Advance, as I never owned it or played it. I just wanted to point out its existence and the fact that it was an impressive port, so moving on. So I've pretty much covered a lot of Driver 2, particularly things that I liked about it, and more often than not, how much it does better than Driver 1. So you would assume that I prefer Driver 2. Well, no, not really. Let me explain. Driver 2 does a lot right, but it does so much wrong. Let me elaborate on this. This game is huge. Almost too huge, I reckon. There are a lot of things in retrospect that it did not need, at least not at the time it came out. First of all, let me get the multiplayer out of the way. That mode was not needed. It was tacked on and it wasn't that fun. You were also locked into a first person perspective. I enjoyed it maybe once or twice, but after that I didn't go back to it. Then there were the on foot sections. This was also a pretty pointless inclusion. And I don't know if I speak for any other fan of this series when I say that I would have rathered we stay confined to the cars we were given for story mode, and the cars we would select for the free roam mode. Not only that, but look at the absolute state of Tanner when he's on foot. He looks terrible! Even for PS1 standards, this is dreadful looking. It clearly wasn't time for this feature to be brought in. Also, why does his shadow make it look like he's holding two guns? This always confused me to the point of actually believing the game was glitched and that there were guns you could carry, that it just didn't register or something techie like that. I had so many questions, it just didn't look right. And then there was the biggest problem this game had, the frame rate. My god, that fucking frame rate. Let me give you a taste of how naive I can be sometimes. So, I live in Europe, a PAL region. All of our games prior to the PS2 era, and mostly even during the PS2 era, are all in 50Hz. Most of the time, that meant our games ran a lot slower than they were intended, especially in the 16-bit era. It also meant that for time trials or maybe speedruns, our results were not very accurate. 1 real minute could be the equivalent of 45 to 50 seconds on the game. That's how bad it was at times, and Driver was like this. It wasn't that bad, in fact you could easily ignore it. It was very much tolerable, but Driver 2 was so bad, and there was always a major reason as to why I leaned more towards the original game growing up. I did like Driver 2, but this would mark the first time I was put off something like a frame rate. I didn't think of it as a technical problem, I just thought that Driver 2 was a genuinely slower game and thought Driver 1 was faster and much more fun as a result of that. And as recently as about a year ago, I was looking at some gameplay videos of Driver 2. I don't remember why, but I do remember seeing the way the game was performing and thought it looked a lot smoother and faster than I recalled, so I got in the mood to turn it on and play it again. And wouldn't you know, it ran like a slug. I was so confused. But I was also fairly new to the idea of importing games from NTSC regions like Japan or North America, because those games played at 60Hz and as such ran faster and ultimately correctly. So I instantly blamed this slowdown on the refresh rate of the games I had. I decided to buy the NTSC American copies of both Driver 1 and Driver 2. Once they arrived, I booted Driver 2 up and played it, and it was almost as slow as it was on the PAL version. What the actual hell, I thought. It turns out that this game was notorious for its slowdown and performance issues, even worse than it was on Driver 1. Driver 1 did have slowdown, plenty of games did in fact, but it was Driver 2's performance that made it one of the reasons a lot of people didn't like it. The reason that the video footage I saw on YouTube showed the game pretty much running flawlessly was something I should have already guessed from the beginning. It was running on an emulator, with the clock speed increased. Because of course it was, how did I not figure that out? So once I came to the realisation that the best way to experience Driver 2, or I suppose any game, from a performance standpoint, is to boot up your computer and run it off of an emulator and increase the clock speed. Sure, best way from a performance point of view, but personally, I would much rather play it on the original hardware, even if it does run like mince. And that brings me to my final point regarding Driver 2's performance. It was too big for its own good. It really had no right being as big and meaty as it was. There was too much going on. I mean, for God's sake, the game was so big, it was shoved onto 2 discs. 2! I have a confession as well. While I have played Driver 2 many times, and I have reached the final third of the game many times as well, I never got to the end. Never beat the game once. I either got stuck or I gave up. But my most recent attempt started to give me a headache due to its slowdown. I didn't get very far, but thankfully I have played enough of the game throughout its 18-year existence to warrant this review. And here is where I segue to my closing opinion. Driver 2 is a good game. It does a lot of good things, but it is hindered by the performance issues that really should not have been there for as late as the game came out in the PlayStation's life cycle. I mean, the PS2 was already out in North America by this point. This should be the stage in the console's life where the games are at their peak, reaching their potential and pushing the console to its limits. And no, not like Driver 2, which didn't push the PS1 to its limits as much as it did push it beyond its limits. The PS1 was not ready for Driver 2 in the state it came out in, and it's a shame it was never improved in any further revisions or re-releases since. Now let's talk about the Xbox One for a minute. Look how well it does backwards compatibility. It not only runs games up to 2 generations older than it, but it improves them from a visual and performance standpoint. The PS2 and PS3 could play PS1 games, but the problem was, beside loading improvements, they never took advantage of those consoles' hardware and buff up the performance of the games. If an emulator can do it, why can't a video console as far as 2 generations ahead do it? My point is that Driver 2 plays just as bad on a PS3 as it does on the original console, and that should never be an issue. But alas, we're too far away from that generation to care about it anymore. It is what it is, and I've come to accept Driver 2 for what the game is. But when it comes down to it, if I want a classic driver fix, I will play the original game quicker than its sequel. I'm happy to have it, but I have my favourites. And that pretty much does it for this episode of GB Reviews. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. If you didn't, give it a dislike. If you want more, maybe subscribe. If you are subscribed and you want to be notified, hit the bell icon. But there is no pressure, I do these videos purely out of my own enjoyment. And with that said, thanks very much for watching. I'm Gamerboy, and this is GB Gaming, where video games come first. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next video. Have a good one.